Welcome to Provisional Aspirations, a podcast exploring the psychology of religion, philosophy, and clinical mental health. I'm Jeffrey Wallace, author, religious trauma survivor, and graduate student pursuing a master's degree in counseling psychology. Join me as I indulge my academic interest in the human spiritual experience, a curiosity that I couldn't fully explore as a member of a high-demand religious group. But now I'm learning out loud, and it feels great.
As a writer, sometimes I find it incredible that when I press these little plastic keys of symbols on them and form them into words, my reader can then get to know what's going on in my inner world. Well, sort of. Philosophers, especially mystics, often speak of the ineffability of truth, of spiritual experiences, of what we mean at the deepest level. It seems that at closer inspection, there's a disconnect between language and thought, on what goes on in our minds and what we say and write. It's not uncommon for philosophers of all types to play with language, rearranging the common usage of a word, phrase, or grammatical device to force the mind in another direction. When done properly, they can communicate an intriguing new worldview to their audience. One such device is Sous Rature. Sous Rature is a French phrase that means under erasure. I was first introduced to Sous Rature typography by Jacques Derrida, a French poststructuralist philosopher who came to influence in the late 1960s and 1970s. His most famous works were Speech and Phenomena, Writing and Difference, Margins of Philosophy, and his seminal 1967 work of Grammatology, upon which a lot of this podcast is based. Derrida is best known for introducing an approach to literary analysis called Deconstruction, a system of thought that attempts to discover the relationship, and also power dynamics, between text and meaning. Recently, deconstruction has been operationalized in post-Christian religious trauma recovery circles. That's how I was introduced to it, as a way of increasing awareness of the connection between sacred texts and various interpersonal value systems, power dynamics, and biases. Jacques Derrida borrows the concept of writing with crossed-out text, that is, under erasure, from the existential philosopher Martin Heidegger. Although Derrida's use of Sous Rature is slightly different. Heidegger, in a letter to a friend about the nature of being, chose to write the word being with an X through it. There's an example of this in the article that corresponds with this podcast if you'd like to look. In an attempt to define nihilism, Heidegger explained that definitions, in general, require the addition of the concept of being, which he capitalized to emphasize the uniqueness of his understanding of the word being. But then, of course, to Heidegger, the subsequent question arose, what to do about the being that presupposes the definition of being? How do you define being without understanding the being that is needed to define it? Heidegger was left with one solution. A thoughtful glance ahead into this realm of being can only write it as being, printed with an X through it. The drawing of these crossed lines at first only wards off especially the habit of conceiving being as something standing by itself. Getting lost in Heidegger's definition of being is topic for another podcast completely. But suffice to say that by printing the word with an X through it, Heidegger was suggesting that there was more to the concept than what was communicated by the word alone. This set the stage for Jacques Derrida's use of Sous Rature text. As mentioned before, Derrida's usage is a bit different. Derrida's grammatology centers around the exercise of viewing any symbol, be it a printed word or a spoken word, as an instance of difference, a comparison of one thing to another. Symbols and concepts signify something, but at the same time, they signify what they are not. The nature of a symbol is determined by its relationship of difference to something else. In the introduction to my copy of Grammatology, written by Gayatri Spivak, it's put this way. Such is the strange being of the sign. Half of it is always not there, and the other half always not that. The structure of the sign is determined by the trace or track of that other, which is forever absent. Here's a captivating example that demonstrates Derrida's writing under erasure, and also helps set up my later discussion on the psychotherapeutic implications of thinking under erasure. Derrida writes in Of Grammatology, citing directly from Freud but adding his own erasures, the ego treats recovery, under erasure, itself as a new danger, under erasure. you'll have to forgive the clumsy nature of speaking about Sous Rature text rather than just reading it on the page as a word with a line through it. But back to the example. When you read recovery, Under Erasure, or danger, Under Erasure, you are prompted to consider what the word does not mean, or what it does not symbolize. You may begin to think about antonyms, origins, associations, or what was there before the symbol was used. Writing Under Erasure also has a way of lifting the word off the page, reminding the reader that the words, strings of words, or even the gaps between the words, are just symbols of a much deeper, richer concept. This is the thought exercise of deconstruction, and it can lead to insights into the meta-connotations of language as it functions in your social or inner world. Tied up with the use of Sous Rature is Derrida's concept of trace. Trace refers to the mark, track, or impression left in the mind by a word's absence. Derrida's concept of trace highlights the temporal aspect of a word. While the word appears in the present, the trace in consciousness includes not only the meaning in the present, but also its disconnection from future and past meanings. Although not explicit in the word itself, these displaced meanings are exposed when the word is explored under erasure. There is a temporal dislocation between what the word embodies in the present and what it contains in the future under the magnifying glass of deconstruction. Derrida was heavily influenced by Freud and often refers to the leading form of psychotherapy in his day, psychoanalysis. In the article Freud and Derrida, Rosaura Martinez-Ruiz discusses how the temporal differentiation of trace aligns with Freudian thought about the temporality of psychoanalysis. Freud acknowledged that the psychic representation used in psychoanalysis also neglects to consider any future psychological situation. Psychoanalysis certainly indicates the traumatic past, as is evidenced in Freud's insistence on formative childhood experiences, but a psychoanalytical snapshot in time does not provide future iterations of traumatic disruption. It doesn't include the trace of the psychoanalytic snapshot, and Freud understood this. Acknowledging that psychic concepts and linguistic signifiers are bound to repeat in the future also led Derrida to what he called hauntology. Hauntology, which of course plays on the common philosophical approach to meaning, ontology, but makes it haunting, states that ontology always contains a future ghost in the form of future repetitions and meanings that are undiscernible in the present. Ruiz talks about this in the following passage. The ghost haunts by inhabiting a place without occupying it. This is how a specter inhabits what is. It doesn't overfill, but it's nonetheless there. It makes itself noticed without presenting itself, without showing itself. But it makes things and produces effects. Just like the ghost that does not present itself in the room, but moves objects and in so doing makes noises. The ghost can also come from the past or from the future. But the thread of his haunting is always that it will present itself. In other words, it is a promise that will be fulfilled in the future. This hauntological ghost, that lives in the trace of a word under erasure, aligns with modern clinical and traumatological thought that describes trauma, even intergenerational trauma, as a ghost that can live in the gaps of our discourse, in what is not spoken. Like the undisclosed meaning exposed in Sous Rature text, the clinician must listen carefully to what the client says, under erasure, to expose the hauntology of their present psychic state. They must smoke out the ghost of traumatology, the unspoken subconscious material that returns to disrupt the balance of the traumatized. Reading and writing Sous Rature trains the mind to hunt for the ghost. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to leave a comment or say hello through the website, and I'll see you next time.